through the Sulu Sea. I did not sail from Singapore by night from choice but because the tide served then. I had to obtain special permission endorsed on my clearance to move from the anchorage after nightfall. The tide was good and the wind better, and we were past the Horseberg long before sunrise. Taking my departure from there, I headed across the China Sea with a fresh monsoon, steering towards the coast of Borneo by way of Subi Kashil, passing north of the light and continuing then toward Sirik and Miri, Borneo oil tank port, and so passing in a general northeasterly direction up the coast of Borneo outside the coastal banks. Making my landfall on the light at Balabac Island, my friends the pilots in Singapore had sent me to the superintendent of the Straits steamships line, there for advice on the best manner of accomplishing this section of the voyage, and the passage of the Sulu Sea. I found this gentleman and his captains most helpful, and indeed should have been at a loss to know how best to put these difficult seas behind me had I been without their excellent advice. The volume of Admiralty sailing directions known as Ocean Passages for the World, a large and concise work containing complete directions for all kinds of vessels going from anywhere to everywhere else, which had hereto been my stand-by in planning the voyage, was not of much use on this occasion, bluntly offering the opinion that the only way for a square-rig ship to sail from Singapore to Sydney in the southeast monsoon was to get away from those waters entirely and then go south about round Australia, making her longitude in the west winds. This, too, was the sensible way to go, but I did not wish to go to Sydney except to refresh the crew and take in stores. I wanted to see some islands, and the only way to do that was to go north about. Perusal of the excellent wind and weather charts published by the United States Hydrographic Office gave me scant encouragement. It looked as if the whole long way from the Sea of Celebes to beyond the Solomons was one endless stretch of doldrums, 35% of calm. I read dubiously in the weather roses over most of this part of the Pacific Ocean. Continued calm is about the worst enemy a sailing ship can face, but I hoped that I might somehow negotiate the Sulu Sea, where the monsoon would be ahead, and find perhaps the wind more southerly than southwest in the Sea of Celebes. This would be fair. I could then make my way towards the Pacific, south of Mindanao, and find the east-going counter-equatorial if I could, of course. I was well aware that the route I chose presented many difficulties. I knew very well that Abel Tasman showed good sense when he sailed southwards to reach the unknown east, on his great voyage centuries before, the voyage that led to his discovery of Tasmania and New Zealand. These, being no Spice Islands, did not make him popular. As far as I knew, no circumnavigator had ever gone the way I now intended. They had, without exception, come from the east to the west, across the whole Pacific, or if they had gone eastwards, had passed to the south of Australia. But I had the engine now, at least I hoped I had the engine. The thing had been overhauled as well as possible at Singapore. It did work. Engineless vessels are fine for the open sea, but for such waters as those of the eastern archipelago and the South Seas, to be without power, ample power is to be severely handicapped, with much of the way lying through belts of calm and doldrum conditions, through reef-infested waters filled with incalculable sets, tides, drifts, and currents, where the lead is no guide and the surveys are too often incomplete and somewhat vague, where a ship may one minute be bowling along with a good breeze and the next find herself pounding upon a coral rock suddenly thrust up in the sea without any warning, and where even now small islands may still be discovered. In such waters as these, even the full-powered vessel must navigate with caution, though she has control of her progress at all times. How then would it be with me? If the engine worked splendidly, which I gravely doubted, I had fuel enough for 4 days. The passage, like as not, would take 4 months. More than that indeed if I stayed at many islands. Well, there I was, and I had further to remember that I should have the west-setting equatorial current strongly against me, its influence spreading over an area of the North Pacific hundreds of miles wide on both sides of its countercurrent. It had been my invariable experience, not only in this ship, that it is always much easier to find adverse currents than those in your favor, and I looked forward with no pleasure to the prospect of some long acquaintance with the Pacific equatorial. But it had always been my policy not to be unduly dismayed by an array of circumstances against me. What of these natural difficulties? I had a good ship, a good crew. She had been dry-docked in Singapore and was thoroughly clean. Indeed, I had been more worried in Singapore than I should ever be by the sea and the difficulty of ocean voyages. It had been expensive there without the unforeseen charges of the college boy's hospital and his fare home. I had also found it necessary to discharge one of the officers for the safety of the ship. Him also I had to repatriate, and one does not send human beings from Singapore to New York and Europe for 18 pence. What with the renewal of insurance and so forth, my expenses there amounted to almost 1,000. I had left the place with barely 100, and that was all I had. The ship was all there was on earth to my name, the ship and a few books. Well, we were stored for 6 months. I should not miss civilization, and I did not mind a hunt a month long for the elusive counter-equatorial. To work out through the Sulu Sea would cost me nothing save anxiety. Such problems as I now faced were under God, and no man would bill me for them. The storms and the navigational difficulties of the ocean voyage, though I came near to losing the ship more than once, never brought me any depression of spirit or undue mental stress. It was the man-made haggard problems of the land that worried me and gave me nightmares. But now the sun shone, and we sailed onwards in the China Sea. The monsoon for the time being blew steadily in the high sails, and the daily routine of the ship at sea was peacefully re-established. At first we made good speed, but then the wind fell light, and we sailed along upright and silent through the China Sea, with the coast of Borneo unseen but close. The greenish-blue water was littered with tree trunks and logs and forest jetsam of every description. We saw sea snakes, oil tankers bound to and from Miri passed us by. We did not see Borneo. I noticed on the chart one day a place called Nia, said by the directions to be the headquarters of the edible bird's nest industry. It was a pity to pass this by when we were so close. I had always wanted to eat a bird's nest, but those I had seen until then seemed scarcely suitable for the purpose. Here we were, a few miles from a town of the right kind, and we had to pass by. I shall have to go back round the world again, I fear, to look in at all the good places I learned of this voyage, learned of but did not see. We saw rain squalls and water spouts, which I gave a wide berth and then calm. A little swallow flew from the shore into the saloon and drank ravenously. I put the dinghy out and pulled round to look at all the trees and things floating in the water, many of them big enough to inconvenience a ship. I found them to be mainly crab-infested logs, probably swept by the rain down the Borneo rivers. We caught some crabs and saw many tropic fish flitting round the sunken roots. These, however, we could not catch. We were 10 days from Singapore to within sight of Balabac Island. I had not used the engine, thinking to conserve fuel. I did not want to use it except as a last extremity, or for going into small harbors and reef-surrounded islands. It was calm when we saw land, and we lolled around all day with the pitch bubbling in the seams beneath the sun in spite of the awnings. A Swedish motor ship, bound probably from Zamboanga, came over to ask us by flags if we needed anything, and being assured that we did not, circled once round us and dipped her flag. Her name, I read, was Peping. The Finnish carpenter was very excited and shouted across in Swedish. We had had a curious-looking steamer in sight all day. I was convinced she was a derelict, though at first glance she appeared to be in commission. She remained in the same place. She was low in the water, too low. She made no smoke, and I saw, as a gentle evening breeze brought us closer, that she was gutted and that the after deck was awash. Late in the evening, with the clouds banked low over Borneo, and all the western sky a flare of brilliant coloring, I dropped a kedge on a reef not far from the Balabac light, quite close to the derelict, which I now perceived to be aground. We could not get any further with that breeze, and I had always wanted to board a derelict. It was the night of the full moon for the month of August. I put out the dinghy at once and rowed over, with Hilgard, and saw that the derelict was the gutted hull of the Japanese tramp steamer Keimarau, a long old vessel, narrow and deep, with all her holds full of water, and the after well deck all slime, where every rising tide had washed. Giant crabs ran at our approach as if they had been long accustomed to being undisturbed. We boarded her using care, and passed the dinghy on its painter under the rusted stern. Even in the moonlight one could see the reef below the surface upon which the deep-loaded tramp, almost upright, stood. Forward her 2 anchors, hastily let go, with the chain up and down and still slack, told of flurried seamanship after she took the ground. She needed no anchoring, she was there to stay. She had been there 2 years or more by the look of her. Here and there her steel decks were rotted through, and the ironwork of the deck-houses crumbled to the touch. In the moonlight the shapes of fishes were dimly to be seen in the holds. She was full of queer, sad noises, like a lonely beach with a quiet sea breaking. The crabs ran, and the slime squelched, and the sea broke over her gently, aft, as if they very water were sorry for her fate. Sad to see a big steamship piled up here where the beams of the lighthouse shone on her bridge. Everything of value was long since gone. She was gutted fore and aft, first by some skilled salvage gang, you could see that, and then I suppose by the first passer-by. But I had not come on a marauding excursion. I was interested in the ship and not her fittings. I paused a while on the crazy remnants of the once proud bridge and stood there, ruminating upon the futility of ships without water under them and the finality of getting on a Salu reef. And I looked across at the riding lights of my little vessel lying silent and still beneath the Borneo sky, and hoped I should never leave her in a like predicament, who knows? We do our best. I very nearly left her worse off than that, one day, but that was a long time afterwards, and it was not in the Sulu Sea. In the morning, still calm, some of the boys pulled over to the derelict to catch fish, or try to, and to swim in the holds. The forehold was the best. The salvage people had got most of her coal cargo out of there. You could dive into the lower hold from the 'tween decks and have a good time. It made an excellent shark-proof enclosure. Later a faint air came, and I hove up the kedge and went on. We had left the yards hoisted and the sails clewed up to them, and not fast, that they might be set quickly, and under all sail I steered now to pass into the Sulu Sea by the south of Balabak Island, meaning to go onwards through the Nasubata Channel as the opportunity came. I had to be very careful round those parts. I was following the advice of my friends in Singapore, and found it good. I had not got very far before the breeze died and the daylight ended, and it was impossible to proceed further or to look for the Nasubata Channel. So I nosed in cautiously toward the Dalawan Bay on Balabak to get the anchor down and wait for better conditions. Dalawan Bay offered the best anchorage in that neighborhood. It was small and protected by two horns of reef that contracted the narrow entrance. It was night then, and I could not see. I anchored as soon as I had soundings, somewhere off the mouth of the bay, and put the dinghy over to pull round, sounding and examining the anchorage as was my custom. This done, I could have gotten a bit closer in, but the darkness is deceptive for conning ships even in well-lit waters. We pulled into the bay and landed on a beach. The moon broke through now. The beach, so far as we could see, was untrodden. Round the curving head of the bay reached a shelf of sand holding back the nearby jungle in the moonlight. Here and there, the jungle, thicker than elsewhere, came almost to the water's edge. Giant trees, festooned with creepers that hung from them like ropes, stood within 20 feet of the water. All the jungle hummed with sound, so that the very earth there seemed to be alive. Queer creatures moved with a sinister rustle of protesting leaves. They were probably cows, and we held our breath. The night air stirred quietly, and the sea coming there to wash the sand lapped at the beach silently, as if it were afraid of the darkness and the dark tangle of the woods. The jungle was so thick we could not penetrate it, and we did not try much there by night. It was a weird place. There were certainly snakes about, if nothing else, though they would have been more afraid of us than we of them. In the morning it was still calm. We could not go on. The sets are said to be strong in the Nasubata Channel, and I did not want to take unnecessary risks. I gave the boys leave to explore the shores of the bay, to stretch their legs and sail in the lifeboat a little, to wash in the fresh-water streams and get some exercise. At the head of the bay, which the daylight showed to be a very good one, we found a small stream with water enough to take the dinghy a good distance inland. We went up this with the matted trees of the jungle meeting over our heads most of the way. Here and there in the backwaters the dinghy grounded. We did not get very far. One of the boys shot a snake, a nasty-looking thing that was lying in a tree. It writhed a little and fell into the water. Later on, by the side of the stream, when we could get no further by water, we had come perhaps 2 miles, we found a jungle trail that led to a small clearing where some natives had made a garden, and there was a small house, a primitive place, standing on stilts in the middle of the clearing. There were no people here. At the stream's entrance we saw 3 natives working on the cane floor of a new hut. One of them spoke a little English, which he said he had been taught at the American school in the town of Balabac. The others had a few Spanish words. They looked rather fierce and somewhat afraid, as if they thought us tax collectors come to levy tribute. They were dressed in cotton pants and singlets bought in the Chinese store at Balabac. On the other side of the bay we found an extensive clearing where a Manila man who felled timber there for company in New York had his home, his cattle, his hogs, and his coconut grove. He had been in the American Navy at one time and spoke fluent English. Round the walls of his small home I saw large notices in Spanish exhorting all and sundry to vote for somebody as President of the Philippines. It was then approaching the time for independence. He chatted pleasantly and seemed pleased to see us, but he warned us to be careful on the beach and swimming. A few days earlier, one of his timber cutters had been sitting on the beach, and when they came back he was not there, only his hat and a piece of one leg. They saw a huge alligator slinking away beneath the water. Life was, he said, quiet enough round those parts, though he brought out his bolo, a heavy, brutal knife beaten from the native steel, to show us. It was no plaything. Sometimes the Japanese came poaching, he said. They seemed to think they could do what they liked. They came ashore and cut down some of his coconut trees. If he had been there, it would have been different. He picked up his bolo, and his eyes glared. Some of the armed constabulary from Balabac had later apprehended the Japanese, but they continued merrily on their way with the constables, putting them ashore later at some place on Palawan and keeping their arms. And there were, he went on, mighty bad people at Cagayan and in the Sulu archipelago. Where we going there? In the midst of this pleasant and instructive day, there came in a small and undistinguished coasting vessel to load timber for Manila. Once a year she came, and she had to choose this day. She came almost alongside us, and a stout, greasy individual shouted to ask if we were in distress. We were not, we said, and noticed his disappointment. Then had we permission to visit the Philippines? Were we cleared inwards from a port of entry with pratique and rubber stamps and all that kind of thing? We were not. We were but lately come from Singapore, and were bound through the Sulu Sea towards the North Pacific and Australia. We were not visiting the Philippines. That had been no part of my intentions. We were anchored off Dalawan Bay, awaiting a fair wind. The directions advise just such a course under the conditions then prevailing. The greasy one seemed not to realize we were a sailing ship. We were inside the territorial limits. It would be hard to go through the Sulu Sea and stay outside them, and there is no anchorage at Dalawan off the Balabac shelf, and were therefore a highly suspicious vessel, probably piratical, and at the very least smuggling. He was desolated, of course, at the thought of causing trouble to a gentleman of his own good calling, but he felt it was his unpleasant duty to summon a gunboat from Manila. He had tried already to rouse the constabulary at Balabac. Unfortunately, the day appeared to be a public holiday, and there was no one there. Well, I knew of course that Dalawan Bay was scarcely a port of entry. I did not expect to find anybody there or any commerce. If sailing ships before making such contacts with the unwanted land as the nature of their voyagings forces upon them, must always first seek fools' permits of some port of entry, then the making of such a passage as I now had before me would be impossible. The nearest port of entry was Holo Sulu, several hundred miles away. If I could have gone there, I would not have anchored, and to be taken for a smuggler, it was humorous. What was I smuggling? I asked this strange bird, since I had not the vaguest idea what might be smuggled into that lonely island. Dry goods, he said, dry goods and bad people. Dry goods. There was poor market for haberdashery round there, as far as I could see. Whence came the bad people? From Bangui, he said, Bangui and North Borneo. Bad braves from these ignoble territories were being smuggled into Palawan and Balabac. His government had told him to be on the lookout for them. They were knifers, butchers, who slew the inoffensive residents and took their fields. I made a mental note to try to go to Bangui some day. Probably, he went on, I had some hundreds on board. Well, he could come and look, but instead he began calling with his wireless, getting busy to Manila first, urgently imploring the authorities there, I gathered, to dispatch a gunboat or two to apprehend this highly suspicious and dangerous vessel on their coasts. I laughed at him, but he was serious enough, though before the day was out he was convinced that after all we were nothing but a peaceful sailing ship bound harmlessly round the world, anchored there for lack of a better place to await a wind. I gave him a note explaining my presence on the coast for the chief of the constabulary at Balabac, and with his timber on board he departed. But I think he was a very disappointed man, and he still expected that a gunboat would be sent to apprehend me. Dalawan Bay was a very fine place apart from the meeting with the suspicious one, but I saw there little outlet for the dry goods business, and less attraction for bad people. About all they would get, if they ever came, would be some coconuts and a few cows. We were within 200 miles of Dalawan Bay for the next 10 days, but saw never as much as the smoke of a gunboat, not a traveler in haberdashery, not a cutthroat from Bangui, or anything else in the least exciting. The Sulu Sea is an interesting stretch of water where the winds blow two ways at once, and more debris floats than comes down from before a Mississippi flood, where the tides turn corners and swing round curves without either order or reason. It is bounded in the north and northeast by the southern Philippine Islands, Mindoro, Panay, Negros, Mindanao; in the west by Palawan and Balabac; in the south by Borneo; and in the east by the Sulu archipelago. It is indeed hemmed in by land, and being itself a headstrong and petulant place, this appears to annoy it. At any rate, it does its best to get out through all the channels open to it, and its tides, its sets, its currents, and its streams are diverse, unsteady, and incalculable. Round all its edges it abounds with reefs, and the way out is a maze. It is lit, it is lit, but not very. Well, the sun glares savagely upon it all the year round. The great Borneo rivers give it their rain. No ships which can help it go there, but it is used by shipping quite considerably. Sandakan, Zamboanga, Iloilo, and Cebu are both reached that way, and the main route from the south to Manila is through the Sulu Sea. A good deal of it has not been properly surveyed, and the mariner is advised to proceed with the utmost caution. Navigation in all these waters requires caution, says the pilot, referring to the East Indies in general, on account of irregular and uncertain currents and the prevalence of coral formations which may have escaped detection even in recent detailed surveys, and of which the lead very often can give no warning. Typhoons sometimes sweep across the Sulu Sea's northern edge. In this pleasant neighborhood we spent 10 days making 200 miles. I would have used the engine on many occasions in that exasperating period, if I could, but it would not work. We began well enough getting through the Nazubata channel without much difficulty, though here we witnessed the peculiar phenomena of two different winds meeting and blowing for a while side by side. We were in both of them at different times, and also in the calm patch between. In each we could see the sea running before the other, in exactly the opposite direction. Here it would have been possible to witness the extraordinary sight of two vessels passing each other bound in opposite directions, each with her yards squared to a fair wind. I had often heard of this, but had been disinclined to believe in it. In the Sulu Sea it would have been quite possible. The reefs were thick at the end of the sea, and I navigated cautiously towards Cagayan Sulu, using bearings from Balabak and Bangui peaks so long as the visibility permitted, remembering to view the result with caution as the day advanced, for mirage plays queer tricks here. Each hour I used Marquis St. Hilaire position lines and soundings to check the bearings. As night came down, I wondered whether to stand on, the wind being good then, or to lie until daylight to the kedge. I stood on, but it was an anxious night. There is no light on Cagayan Sulu, and I must have come close that night to numerous reefs. If any of them had touched my ship, why, I should have stayed there, with the K. Maru. I was glad to see Cagayan Sulu right where it ought to be in the morning. It was hot then, and fluky and calm, and we had the place in sight 3 days. But I did not mind that overmuch, for once safely there, the worst of the reefs were behind me. We saw the islets Kinapusan, Pamelican, Manda, and Malagi, but I did not head towards any of these, though Malagi looked attractive. Cagayan has no port of entry, and I had no need to go there. So I beat and drifted about to Catspaw doldrum airs, tacking when the ship had headway enough, and wearing when she had not getting anywhere much for all my pains, dribbling and drifting day after day through tide rips and light overfalls, with long lines of floating logs and trees and old coconuts, and all the jungle debris floating by, and once half of a native fence on a small piece of tangled earth that must have come down before the flood of some mighty stream. We drifted within 3 miles of a tiny islet marked on the chart as Mambahenahon. It was calm, and I put out the dinghy and pulled over to discover, if I could, why so small a place had so long a name. I found the place a small piece of brown rock, almost sheer, steep too, with a narrow ledge-like shelf on which it was possible to land. Tiny tropic fish swam in pools between the rocks, and crabs ran, and overhead the disturbed seabirds wheeled and cried. The top of the rock was accessible in one place, but thick with vegetation and thorns. I saw a fireplace of stones where the natives had been cooking. While we were there, with the evening coming down, a small boat from Cagayan came up to the islet. It was a prow from Cagayan to Holo, with copra 30 feet long and carrying 11 hands all told, an indefinite number of whom were passengers. The vessel I noticed carried several well-kept fowls which had been trained to perch with their afterparts outboard, a very useful accomplishment for seagoing poultry in any small craft. But I hope they went about ship when they laid their eggs. This they doubtless had been trained to do, and they would not drop their eggs in the sea. Some stalwart young fellows landed from the prow with fish spears and soon had a string of fish and several crabs for their supper. One of them was chewing gum, and they both had a little English. I went back to the ship, and we dribbled on. We came one night within sight of a light off the coast of Borneo Taganak, outside Sandakan, and I went round to keep away from the coral patches in that neighborhood. We beat there day after day, though in truth not beating half as much as just putting the ship about to changing airs. There was scant progress in such sailing, but what could be done? The wind, if there was a wind, kept its general direction from the southwest. It was the southwest monsoon. If it had been strong, we could have beat out. But it was just loafing. The days were hot and enervating. Once, after a particularly trying 24 hours, the noon position showed that we had drifted back some 15 miles. But I was not unduly worried over that. There was no point in being worried. It was dispiriting, of course, but the only thing to do was to keep on. I had been studying the pilots and the charts for those parts, and had come across a place called Balimbing in Tawi, in the Sulu archipelago, labeled on the Admiralty chart in warning letters, "Pirates." What pirates? I had to go in there. The little isles that surrounded Tawi are sparsely inhabited and have generally been regarded as refuges for pirates, says the Eastern Archipelago Pilot, Volume 1. It sounded good. I was not going to pass by a place like that, gunboats or no gunboats. I saw there was a constabulary station at Bongao, the chief town of Tawi. I would pay my respects to the chief there and explain to him my business, or rather, my lack of business. It has invariably been my experience that people in real charge of anything are seldom infected by the full airs and the stupid ideas of their underlings or their unofficial assistants. I would go to Tawi, though an attractive place named Umpapui, where wild pigs abound, also sounded rather well. We could have done with a few pigs, and I should have liked to see Umpapui. It was all very well, my reading of the pirates, probably long dead, and deciding to go to this place and to that. We could go nowhere without wind. It was calm now and stayed so, and more hot and humid than ever. It rained every day. When it was not raining, the sun burned fiercely. There were nights when the calms were more still than any I had previously known, even on the Pacific line, with all the sky so dead that the very twinkle had gone from the stars, and the sea was flatter than Brisset Pond, and all the ship was still motionless, not even gently lifting with that slow movement so seldom absent from the sea, all quieted, with the sails blackened shapes hanging dead from the yards, and not a block creaking. It was a calm, unnatural foreboding, almost frightening. The helmsman spoke softly. The unsteered course to their somnolent reliefs. The lookout on the foresail had stood in silence in the same spot, not moving. The red and green side lights threw long reflections in the dull water to stay where they were thrown, not rippling, not shimmering. The second mate on the watch hung over the rail aft as if he had been built there with the ship, and was as incapable of movement without wind as she was. Calms such as this, when all the tiniest ripplings of the sea have gone, and with them even the quiet gurglings at cutwater and stern, are unusual outside a tropic lagoon. In the course of time we made some progress. 8 days after leaving Dalawan Bay, the northeastern end of Borneo was in sight at daybreak. The setting sun showed us exactly the same skyline, tree trunks, coconuts, jellyfish, and tide rips drifted by, and it was as hot as Hades. The navigation lesson in the afternoon was much interrupted by my looking for the Pearl Bank, and several times mistaking mirages for it, for a line of floating coconuts can look astonishingly like a reef when your eye is near the water level. We passed by all the banks and all the reefs, and a week out from Cagayan Sulu, had come at last within sight of Tawi Tawi. Now, for once, the second mate was able to induce the machinery to work. It was calm, and I went into the anchorage of Chongos Bay, between Papabog Island and Sanga Sanga. It was evening when we came to anchor behind an island of coconut groves, with a native village on stilts close by, and Bongao Peak bluff and wooded and worn, holding up the rain clouds of the southwest monsoon. I looked about me for the pirates of Balambing, but saw none. No gunboats, or port officials, or visitors of any kind. I was mighty tired from that trying passage of the Sulu Sea, and turned in for a night's good rest, leaving a double watch on deck just as a precaution.